What's up everyone and welcome back to the World History Channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. Heartbreaking details about the Elephant Man's Joseph Merrick. Joseph Merrick was born in Leicester, England, on August 5, 1862. He began to show signs of an abnormal disorder when he was about 5 years old, including large growths on his skin and bones. By the time he reached adulthood, the circumference of Merrick's head was roughly 3 feet, with growths disfiguring his face and jaw, rendering him nearly unable to communicate. At the age of 21, Merrick fled the workhouse he had been forced to live in due to his disability, and he took up with a traveling human oddity exhibit, joining the ranks of other famous freak show performers and becoming known as the Elephant Man. When the public interest in freak shows waned in England, he was forced to spend the remainder of his days living in a London hospital. Merrick died in April of 1890 due to complications from his condition. He was just 27 years old. Thought to have suffered from an extremely rare congenital disorder called Proteus syndrome, also known as Weidman syndrome, Merrick is one of the most famous medical oddities in recent history. Merrick was very human, and outside of his disfigurement, his life was also full of tragedy, despite the fact that he spent much of his brief existence on display looking like a soulless object. This list explores the most heartbreaking facts about Joseph Merrick, the Elephant Man. He was born a healthy child. Joseph Carey Merrick was born in Leicester, England, on August 5, 1862, to Joseph and Mary Jane Merrick. For the first 5 years of his life, Joseph was a happy and healthy little boy, completely unaware of the horrific disfigurement that was to come. It was around the age of 5 that patches of discolored lumpy skin began to appear on his body, which his parents actually thought were the result of Mary Jane being scared by a stampeding elephant while she was pregnant. Merrick was able to have a relatively normal childhood and attend school, though his condition worsened significantly as he got older. He had 3 siblings who all died remarkably young. For Joseph and Mary Jane Merrick, creating a family proved to be a doomed endeavor. Joseph Carey was the first of 3 of the children born into the family who would die at young ages. His brother William Arthur was born in January of 1866 and died from scarlet fever in December of 1870 at just 4 years old. His sister Marian Eliza was born in September of 1867, also with physical disabilities, though less severe than those of Joseph himself, and she died of myelitis-related seizures in 1891. When he was just 11 years old, his mother passed away. Joseph's mother passed away in 1873 from bronchial pneumonia. He was just 11 years old, and his condition was beginning to worsen. Joseph had a special bond with his mother, who cared for and nurtured him. Merrick would later describe the death of his mother as the greatest sadness in my life. His father would remarry just 1 year later, but the passing of Merrick's mother marked the end of his life's only loving relationship. He was beaten and rejected by his father. After the death of his mother, the road got significantly tougher for the still young Joseph. His father remarried, and Joseph left school at 13 to find work, spending time as a door-to-door salesman with a burlap sack covering his face until growths on his hand rendered him unable to work. At 17, Joseph was expelled from his home by his father, who had severely beaten him for being unable to earn money. Forced out onto the streets, the teenaged Merrick was homeless and starving. His uncle briefly took him in, but unable to care for him in his condition, he was soon forced to send his ailing nephew out into the world on his own. He was forced to live in a workhouse at 17. 17 years old and homeless with a rare medical condition, Joseph Merrick had no choice but to seek refuge at the Leicester Union Workhouse. Workhouses at that time were prison-like environments where those considered unemployable performed grueling labor. Merrick was miserable in the Union Workhouse, and he despised his time there. After a few years, his condition got worse and made it hard for him to do the jobs that were given to him. In 1884, he left to go it alone. Even doctors looked at him like a human oddity. After leaving the Leicester Union Workhouse in 1884, Merrick decided to capitalize on his disfigurement by joining a human oddities show. He became known as the Elephant Man, half elephant, as part of the Gaiety Palace of Varieties. He was shown to a lot of people in Leicester, Nottingham and London. It was during his time in the capital city that he was displayed across the street from the London hospital, where doctors and surgeons would come marvel at his condition. Even to trained professionals, he was a mere spectacle. He was robbed of his life savings. Though he was paid and treated relatively well in the freak show circuit, Joseph Merrick's professional life would prove short-lived. By the mid-1880s, human oddity exhibits had fallen out of favor with the English public, so Merrick's manager brought him to Belgium in hopes of attracting a larger audience. But Merrick's manager turned on him shortly into the tour, severely beating him and stealing his life savings, before abandoning him in a foreign land. Penniless and destitute, Merrick had to return to England on his own. He spent his final years in the hospital. When Merrick returned to England, he was mobbed by odd spectators upon arrival. Dispersing the gawking crowds, police came to his aid but found him to be panicked and unintelligible, his condition making it nearly impossible for him to speak at this point. There was a card in Merrick's coat belonging to a Frederick Treves, a surgeon who had met Merrick during his previous time in London, so police, unsure what else to do, contacted the man. Treves took Merrick into his hospital in the Whitechapel area of London, cordoning off several rooms for him to live in. Merrick lived the rest of his days there, forging a strong friendship with Treves in the process. He died wanting to be like everybody else. Joseph Merrick was discovered dead on April 11, 1890, at the age of 27, in his home at the London hospital. Merrick had to sleep in an upright position with his head swollen to 3 feet in circumference, resting on his knee, so that the weight would not asphyxiate him as he rested. But that spring morning it appeared he had deviated from his routine, with his friend and Dr. Frederick Treves suggesting that he just tried to lay down like everybody else, a process which tragically snapped his spinal cord, killing him instantly. His physical deformities caused him to sustain other injuries. Given that Joseph Merrick's enlarged features were caused by swelling and bone masses growing in unexpected places, it became extremely difficult for Joseph to perform even the most basic maneuvers because of the heft of his limbs. When he was just a child, he fell and suffered a significant hip injury, which rendered him lame for the rest of his life. Merrick's inability to perform basic bodily maneuvers is also the thing that would lead to his death, as the weight of his head caused his neck to eventually snap. He wrote his own heart-wrenching autobiography. Joseph Merrick was considered to be quite intelligent, an avid writer. He even penned his own autobiographical pamphlet, which he distributed to audiences while on exhibit as a human oddity. He also wrote many letters, often thank-you notes to caregivers and those who had shown him kindness. Merrick frequently signed his letters with a poem, The Poignant False Greatness by Isaac Watts. "'Tis true my form is something odd, but blaming me is blaming God. Could I create myself anew, I would not fail in pleasing you. If I could get to every pole, or grasp the ocean with a span, I would be measured by the soul. The mind's the standard of the man." For decades, people referred to him by the wrong name. The stage version of The Elephant Man, which was written by Bernard Pomerantz in 1977, features the main character of a deformed elephant man whose biography closely mirrors that of Merrick. The major difference between the two is that the protagonist in the play is named John. Why the discrepancy? Because Frederick Tevis, a prominent London doctor who first saw Merrick on display, recorded his name as John in his memoir. And the incorrect name stuck, even making its way into popular culture portrayals of Merrick well past his death. Joseph Merrick's life reads like a cruel fable, one where the moral gets buried beneath years of agony, rejection, and a quiet dignity that refused to be destroyed. Joseph was born in Leicester, England, on August 5, 1862, and at first glance resembled any other healthy child. But by the time he was 5, his body started to lie to him. Thick, lumpy patches of skin appeared. His bones swelled in irregular, grotesque ways. His lips ballooned. His right arm grew disproportionately large and nearly useless. And the circumference of his head reached a staggering 3 feet, a weight so immense he couldn't lay down to sleep like other people. In a time before modern medicine could even begin to understand what was happening to him, young Joseph was viewed with fear, suspicion, and morbid curiosity. His mother, Mary Jane, cared for him deeply and protected him from the stares and taunts of others. But she died when Joseph was just 11, a loss so profound that he would later call it the greatest sadness of my life. After her death, the last shred of unconditional love he knew vanished. His father remarried quickly, and the new stepmother had no patience or tenderness for the child with strange growths and limited ability to speak. Life grew harsher still. At 13, Joseph left school and tried to find work, covering his face with a burlap sack as he knocked on doors attempting to sell trinkets. But his deformities made it impossible for him to earn a living, and his father, rather than show compassion, beat him mercilessly for failing to bring home money. Eventually, he was cast out of the house entirely. Homeless, penniless, and unable to support himself, Joseph entered the Leicester Union Workhouse at the age of 17, a hellish institution meant to grind down the poor and disabled. He remained there for 4 long, joyless years. Life inside was a grim blur of hunger, cold, and grueling labor. He could barely complete due to his deteriorating condition. The workhouse was supposed to reform the poor, but in Joseph's case, it merely caged a young man who had already lost everything. However, despite the dire circumstances, his spirit persisted. In 1884, when he was around 21 years old, Merrick managed to escape the workhouse and took an unimaginable leap of faith. He decided to display himself as a human curiosity. With no other options, he joined a traveling freak show and became known as the Elephant Man. As degrading as it sounds today, these shows were often the only way severely disabled individuals could survive. Unlike the cruelty he experienced at home, the sideshow at least offered him a shred of agency and a paycheck. He was exhibited throughout England, in Leicester, Nottingham, and eventually London, where he gained a reputation as a wonder, a horror, a curiosity no one could forget. His body was so unrecognizable as human that even seasoned doctors were speechless. People paid to stare at him. But behind the thick, tumorous skin and enlarged features was a quiet, gentle soul with a sharp mind and an aching heart. And although he was referred to as a monster, he endured the ogling with grace. One of those curious onlookers was Frederick Treves, a surgeon at the London hospital, who first met Merrick when the show was housed across the street. Treves arranged a private medical examination and documented his extraordinary condition, which included large, cauliflower-like tumors on the head and body, a misshapen spine, and severe damage to his jaw, making speech nearly impossible. Treves thought Merrick's name was John, and unfortunately, this error would echo throughout history, with plays, films, and biographies all mistakenly calling him John Merrick. The name stuck, even though Joseph himself had signed it clearly on his letters. Merrick ended up on the freak show circuit in Belgium, where tragedy once more struck. His new manager robbed him, beat him, and abandoned him in a foreign land. He lost all his savings and was forced to return to England penniless. When he arrived in London, the crowds surrounding him grew so frenzied and aggressive that police had to intervene. But they didn't know who he was, until they found Treves's card in his pocket. Treves arranged for Merrick to live in the London hospital, in a special unit cordoned off from the public. There, for the first time in his adult life, Merrick found peace. He wasn't put on display for money. He wasn't beaten or ridiculed. He was treated as a human being. Literature and royalty were among the visitors. One woman, upon being introduced to Merrick, gently shook his hand and smiled. The first time, he said, that a woman had smiled at him. He burst into tears. His friendship with Treves deepened. He was given books to read, paper to write on, and the freedom to be himself. Merrick loved poetry and wrote letters regularly, often quoting his favorite verse from Isaac Watts. "'Tis true my form is something odd, but blaming me is blaming God." Despite everything he'd suffered, he clung to dignity. He found comfort in beauty. But Merrick's condition continued to worsen. His body, ravaged by what is now thought to be Proteus syndrome or possibly a combination of rare disorders, grew increasingly fragile. He fell once and hurt his hip, leaving him permanently unable to walk. Due to the size and weight of his skull, he was forced to sleep sitting upright, leaning forward, his head resting on his knees. If he laid down like others, his own anatomy would suffocate him. On April 11, 1890, Joseph Merrick was found dead in his hospital bed. It appeared he had tried to sleep lying down just once, just to know what it felt like to be normal, and his neck snapped under the pressure of his own head. He was 27 years old. In the end, he died not of disease or accident, but of yearning. His simple wish to lie down like everybody else cost him his life. Though Joseph lived in a time of ignorance and cruelty, he left behind a legacy that's far more than just physical deformity. His story continues to have an impact because it demonstrates both the quiet heroism of someone who refused to let that rejection define him and the inhumanity of a society that could so thoroughly reject a man based on how he looked. Even after death, the tragedy continued. His skeleton was preserved for medical study, but his soft tissue, his flesh, his identity, was reportedly discarded. There's no grave for Joseph Merrick. No headstone bearing his real name. Just bones, poetry, and the memory of a man who bore unimaginable pain with heartbreaking grace. He never stopped being human, even when the world insisted he was something else. Joseph Merrick's life reminds us that beneath every oddity is a person with dreams, with sorrows, with immense capacity for love and suffering. It is both a tale of injustice and a testament to dignity. And in the end, it is not his body that defines him, but his soul. You probably know Joan of Arc as a tough-as-nails warrior maiden from France, but there's a lot more to the rags to riches drag story of this smart soldier than just that. So who was Joan of Arc really? While there are plenty of surprising facts about Joan of Arc's life, the basics of her biography are these. Born an illiterate peasant girl, she started hearing voices around puberty, claiming saints were speaking to her. Eventually, Joan got in touch with increasingly important people, many of whom became convinced of her sincerity, and she eventually allied with the heir to the French throne to oust the English invaders. This led to her being considered one of history's greatest female war heroes. Once she was captured by the English, Joan was jailed, forced to confess to tons of charges, and burned at the stake. The enigmatic journey that led Joan of Arc to martyrdom and sainthood is fraught with deceit, plots, and magical omens. One of the most intriguing figures of the Middle Ages is Joan of Arc, whose voices may or may not have been the most prescient form of mental illness in history and Merlin's prediction of her coming. So, was it God? Was it magic? Or was it mental illness? The wizard Merlin foretold Joan's coming. Joan emerged onto the national stage at exactly the right time, seemingly fulfilling several prophecies that had been circulating that foretold of a virgin from Lorraine, the region of France where Joan hailed from, who would save France from the invading English. One such augury apparently came from the legendary wizard Merlin, who, in between helping King Arthur make big decisions, said that a maiden would come out of an ancient forest to rescue France. Another story told that a virtuous woman would redeem France after a fallen woman, aka France's allegedly licentious queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, who scandalized the court with her affairs, made it the talk of the town. And then there's the prophetess Marie of Avignon, who claimed a woman in armor would save France. Did Joan fake her own death? After being burned at the stake on May 30, 1430, Joan was dead. Or was she? Some scholars theorize that it was at least possible that a substitute maiden could have been burned in Joan's place, with Joan assuming a new identity after the fact. And the legacy of the Maid of Lorraine lived on. So much so that a bunch of pretenders dressed up as Joan and said La Pucelle was still alive. This was pretty common during this time, but one woman really stood out, Claude de Armoises. In one version of this history, Claude was a real-life wife and mother who was supported by Joan of Arc's real-life brothers. They supposedly recognized her at first sight as their sister. But she only played Joan for a short time before she admitted her guilt. However, in the alternate version of this tale, Claude is the identity the real Joan took on after the bait and switch at the stake. She fought alongside a Satanist and child murderer. One of Joan's most trusted and important soldiers was a guy named Gilles de Rice, who met her the first time she showed up to meet the Dauphin. He led some of her troops and aided Joan when she was injured at Orleans, but in reality he wasn't that great of a guy. As it turns out, de Rais was probably one of the first recorded serial killers. He was said to have been guilty of torturing, raping, and murdering hundreds of kids in a dungeon, as well as worshipping the devil. Was Joan a secret royal love child? Could Joan have gotten to such high office without royal help? Probably not, but some have said she had really intense kingly connections. So much so that she was actually a secret royal love child. One theory suggested Joan wasn't born a peasant girl, but she was really Charles VII's illegitimate half-sister/cousin, the child of his mother, the famously licentious Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, and her lover/his uncle, Louis, Duke of Orleans. This was supposedly the reason Joan was able to pick out the Dauphin from amongst a bunch of his courtiers upon meeting him for the first time. Sadly for conspiracy theorists, this probably wasn't true. But that doesn't stop scholars from claiming it could have been the case every once in a while. Joan might have confessed after being threatened with rape. After her capture by the English, Joan of Arc was charged with a host of wrongdoings. Witchcraft, horse theft, and cross-dressing, to name just 3. But she pled not guilty to most of them. That is, until the guards depriving her of basic creature comforts threatened her with rape. According to Joan, they never carried out their horrible threat, but such a heinous act probably led to her pleading guilty to a number of her charges. Promised life imprisonment instead of death, she agreed to sign a guilty confession. But then she revoked it and consigned herself to being burned at the stake. Was it milk poisoning, epilepsy, or saints? When she hit puberty, Joan began to hear saints speaking to her. They told her to be pious and eventually to save France from the English. Modern scientists have posthumously diagnosed Joan with conditions like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or a specific kind of epilepsy to explain her hearing voices. Others have suggested she suffered from bovine tuberculosis, postulating that the consumption of unpasteurized milk could have given Joan brain lesions. She might have been politically manipulated by a queen. In order to actually get to the Dauphin, heir to the throne, the future King Charles VII, Joan had to befriend some pretty high-profile people. Charles's mother-in-law, the powerful royal Duchess Yolande of Aragon, later Anjou, was a big advocate for Charles to take power over the English and his rival, the Duke of Burgundy. Yolande probably heard about Joan from her son René, ruler of Lorraine, where Joan grew up and first preached. Yolande may have presented Joan in front of the army as a figurehead to inspire Charles's troops as a political and propagandistic tool. She impressed her future king by recognizing him in a crowd. When Joan's saints told her to go help the Dauphin,